Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schrader. Today we have Carol Roth on the show. She is a former judge on Mark Burnett's America's Greatest Makers television show, former host of WGN Radio's The Noon Show, a panelist on current events and business show Bulls and Bears on Fox, as well as a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling author of the books, The Entrepreneur Equation, Evaluating the Realities, Risks, and Rewards of Having Your Own Business. And that's very relevant to the current work-from-home environment, as well as it's looking like some new legislation that's going to be passed that are not very business-friendly. And the new book, The War on Small Business, How the Government Used the Pandemic to Crush the Backbone of America. So without further ado, Carol Roth, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to start, let's start with your first book, and then we'll move on to your new book, and then some subsequent legislation and deliberation that's been happening even since 2020 PPP program and other government stimulus were passed. So let's start with that first book called The Entrepreneur Equation. In that book, you talk about what it takes to build a valuable business. Can you tell us what is your definition of a valuable business, as well as what it takes to build one?
Sure. So first is actually defining a business, which is a standalone entity that doesn't require you to be there in order for it to have value. I think a lot of people have what I refer to in the book as jobbies, which are hobbies disguised as jobs or businesses, or job businesses, which are businesses that are entirely dependent on that person. And if that person is on vacation or, God forbid, gets hit by a bus, the business really doesn't have any standalone value. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with any of these structures, but if you were looking to build equity value and sort of long-term wealth and be able to sell and exit the business, if you have the jobby, it's a great way to test out the business, but it's not going to quite get you there. And then if you have a business that's entirely dependent upon you to be there, if you no longer want to be there, it obviously ceases to have a lot of value. So I think there's the piece of really focusing on are you creating this kind of separate entity that has equity value unto itself? And I think that's an important distinction. As you're doing that, obviously, it's really hard to say specifically what makes each business a success. But in terms of meeting customer needs and desires, usually it boils down to having the right person going after the right opportunity at the right time. And there are all kinds of examples of similar businesses where they've had different entrepreneurs, or they've come out in different market environments with different resources behind it, or even the same business that's been owned by different people that have had wildly different outcomes. And so, I kind of think of that three-legged stool, right person, right opportunity, the right time is kind of being as close to a special sauce as I have seen over my career.
So I would say a vast majority of businesses that have been started in the United States are the jobbies, or the people who are, it's just a one man show, or maybe two or three, but pretty much a one person show.
Yeah, I call it one or family. Maybe.
Yeah, one or family,
like restaurants. Yeah.
So if you've spent all of your time so far, like branding your business as, let's just say for me, for example, like the Adam Schrader business. It's, I'm the face of it. I'm all anybody's known. How do you make a transfer? Let's just say it's even possible to do it. Let's say I have a business that can be done that way and it can shift over to something I can build equity in. How do you make that shift and not lose kind of your name recognition in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's really difficult, if you are the brand, and I think that if it's something that you're considering, you may want to sort of transition in multiple steps. So maybe it's Adam presents XYZ, and then as XYZ gets to be more known, it then just becomes XYZ, because obviously, when you are the brand, people want you to be the one to give them the advice or to, do the massage or, whatever it is that is your goods or service. But obviously that's not scalable. There's only 24 hours in the day, and you need to have time to eat and to shower, hopefully from time to time. So, you want to be able to make that transition. And so working on that multiple step branding, and then finding ways to, really lift up other people. But if you think about like the biggest and most successful companies out there, even though you may know the entrepreneur behind them, you don't go to Amazon because of Jeff Bezos, or you don't, use Facebook because of Mark Zuckerberg. In fact, you might use it in spite of these entrepreneurs. And so they've really put the business and the customer proposition front and center. And so if you want to move your business from being entirely dependent upon you, you do need to reposition it and find ways to, whether it's existing customers or with new customers, you have them feel confident in the level of service and offering that they're getting, even if it's not coming from you.
So that sounds to me like something that might be easier to do with new customers. But let's say let's say I have a list of 20 clients who I've worked with since the beginning, and they're used to coming, straight to me because I'm the face, I'm the guy who does everything. As I'm building up, what tips do you have for kind of handing that off gently, but in a way that, is good for the business?
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do is, as you build out your product and service offering, and obviously this is completely dependent on the type of business. And
Right.
One of the challenges we have in a small business space is that, being an accountant is different than being a massage therapist, is different than being a social media guru, is different than, whatever. But, we can kind of draw some of the same parallels depending on the industry. Is that to the extent you expand your service offering with ancillary services, because obviously we know it's much easier to sell more to customers who already know, like, and trust you and love the service, then maybe you're introducing somebody else with new products and services. And so that becomes an easy way to do it. Maybe it's co-handling people's accounts from time to time until they kind of get used to and have that rapport. But you are right. It is, again, dependent upon what it is that you're doing. It is often easier to make that introduction with something new, whether it's a new customer or a new product, than having somebody who's used to having something and then having that expectation shift. But, I do think it's important to be honest. Like, for example, my accountant, who I've been with at multiple different companies, I'm there because that I like my accountant. But at some point in time, he's going to retire, I know. And, he hasn't really sort of teed up anybody else who knows our business and has that level of familiarity, or that we have the familiarity. And I think that's a missed opportunity, because when he does retire, we're going to be scrambling to figure out where to go.
I want to talk a little bit about the risk involved with starting a business. So in my case, I'll share my commentary, but I want to hear what you talk about in your book and what you recommend to people. I was debt free. I started my business in my mid-20s. My first business, it was not the business that you espouse, which is, if I got hit by a bus, would the business still be running? No, it's a one-man show. But that's okay because it allowed me to start a second business, which is not a one-man show. But I had no debt, no student debt, no credit card debt, not married, no kids, mid-20s. I was young. I had great experience working for a few years in the corporate world. And I said, hey, let's jump in and do this. Now, I would say most of our listeners are not that age demographic. So what do you recommend people do to assess the risk and rewards of business ownership based on their personal circumstances?
Yeah, obviously it does come down to that personalization because first of all, every individual has a different goal for what it is that they want out of the business. And the great thing about being an entrepreneur or a small business owner is economic freedom. And that economic freedom doesn't just mean wealth creation, but it means flexibility. It means pursuing a passion. It means different things to different people. So I think you have to have a really clear benchmark that you are holding up what it is you're assessing against and knowing why it is that you're doing it. Because I feel like a lot of people don't really know why they're doing it. It's just like, oh, I had a great idea and I've kind of moved forward and I never really stopped to think about like what it is that I'm trying to get out of this. And it makes it more difficult to know where to go if you don't know where it is that you plan to end up. So I think that it's really about defining that up front. And then it is about your personal situation. What is your financial situation look like? One of the things that I always talk about is the rule of 3 in business, which is that everything takes 3 times longer, is 3 times as expensive, and is 3 times more difficult than you expect it to be, and that frankly it probably should be. And so, going without your traditional income from a job and potentially having to make some investments into a business, and knowing that, it may take you, not a year, but 3 years to do so, what does that look like for you? And are you in that position to take on risk? And obviously that depends on your financial profile. Like you said, if you have debt, if you have a family to take care of, where you stand vis-a-vis retirement and a whole slew of other things. And that's a personal assessment. And then also like where you stand within your family, because obviously if you're a young person who's single, you have a lot more flexibility in that regard because there aren't other people who are depending on you, whether it's to be there for a baseball game or a ballet recital, or it's, to provide, a certain level of income or whatever else that the business may take away. So I think it is really important for you to be thinking about all of those things. Why are you doing it? What does my financial situation look like? How much am I going to have to invest? What's going on personally as some of the factors as you consider when's the right time for you to do this.
I want to talk about real quick your spinach in your teeth. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how do you build a team of people willing to tell you have spinach in your teeth?
Yeah, spinach in your teeth is pretty straightforward. You go out to lunch with somebody, they have spinach salad, it gets stuck in their teeth. Do you tell them or do you not tell them? And I actually always say that it's much kinder to tell somebody that you're helping them, because if you don't let them know that there's an issue, then they may be going out to a date or a big job interview or, just going about their day afterwards and they look like a fool. And you're just not willing to have that uncomfortable discussion and hold up that mirror. And so, I'm a fan of telling people when they have spinach in their teeth, and sometimes you need to ask permission depending on the situation. But, I think that's a great interview question, or even an interview scenario. Walk into an interview with a piece of spinach stuck in your teeth as the interviewer and see if the person points it out to you and see how they handle that situation, because you don't want to surround yourself with yes men and yes women because you're not going to get that same level of critical input. And it's also important to see the way they approach it too, because there's a kind way to approach that situation, and there's a non-kind way to approach the situation. So I actually think it'll tell you a lot about a person.
Carol, let's switch gears, talk about your latest book, The War on Small Business, how the government used the pandemic to crush the backbone of America. That sounds somewhat of a grim title. Tell us a little bit more about it, and also what's currently in store, because we have the same political party and all three, well, the Supreme Court doesn't count, but in Congress and in the White House, we have the same political party, Democrat. What can we expect?
So you mentioned that it sounds like a grim title, and it was really a grim situation, and has some really long tail effects to it that aren't so great for economic freedom. So the basic scenario that happened during 2020 and is continuing to happen as we're recording this is that the government picked winners and losers. They decided who was going to thrive and who was going to fight to survive under these labels that they came up with, essential and non-essential, which is horrendous. The government shouldn't be telling somebody who's putting food on the table that they are non-essential, but they did. And they did this not based on data or science, but they did it based on political clout and connections. So as you could imagine, small businesses, even though they're 99.9% of all of the business entities here in the US as well as worldwide, even though they account for about half the economy and GDP, about half of the jobs, and are, have always been one of the biggest sources of job growth. And they're very highly decentralized, and they don't have a lot of political pull. And frankly, they just mostly want to be left alone to run their business. And so they did not fare as well in terms of having that political clout and connection, and they bore the brunt of these mandates that really subjugated their property rights. And what this did was it enabled the biggest transfer of wealth that we have ever seen from Main Street to Wall Street. We had a scenario through this picking winners and losers, both directly by shutdown mandates and indirectly through Federal Reserve intervention, where you had a handful of technology companies, I think it was 7 technology companies, that gained $3.8 trillion in value. At the same time where you had hundreds of thousands of small businesses that were permanently shuttered and millions more that were struggling for survival. And so this entire structure that was put out, whether you believe there should have been shutdowns or not, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, the reality is that it wasn't consistent. We weren't all in it together. We didn't all go through lockdowns, and the entities that were targeted were not targeted by data or science, and they did not receive appropriate compensation for giving up their property rights for the good of society, which under the Constitution is considered eminent domain. If the government takes your property for the good of society, they need to give you appropriate compensation. And so the small amount of overall spending that was done on small business, whether it be PPP or otherwise, really didn't come close to making up for the damage that was done. And it certainly was sort of not the best way to approach, the situation. And now we're dealing with the outcomes of all of the central planning, which is everything from labor shortages to the supply chain being choked up, and so on and so forth, inflation, and all of these sort of long tail impacts, which again, the small and the most vulnerable, unfortunately, are shouldering the impact of.
Yeah, I'll just state a few things based on what you said. And the first thing has to do with the lockdowns and a lot of these rules that weren't based on science. One of the things that annoyed me the most was when you put a label on businesses and industries saying you're essential, you're not essential, you had a huge chunk of healthcare workers coming out and saying, my job is the most essential, therefore, because of my degree or because of my job, you must listen to me. And I say, lock yourself at home. I say, put on a mask, be 3 feet away from each other, then 6 feet, then 30 feet. And they just made up all these rules, like you said, without any science. And the government, I think, created the problem because it was just draconian everywhere. Even here in Florida, where I live, probably one of the freest states in the country, you still had a segment of people saying, getting into fights because somebody was 2 feet away from them in line at a grocery store, or getting into fights over face masks. And it's still going on today. I mean, I saw a husband and wife couple a few weeks ago fighting because they were about to go into a club and the wife had her mask on and the husband said he was not going to wear his mask, and they were outside late at night just fighting and people were watching them. And this is all just, I think it's dumb. I think it's unnecessary, but hey, that's what it is right now. But then as far as actual economic policy goes, I'm not a Democrat by any means, but I personally think that I'm in that right bracket where we don't make a household income where there's a huge jump in the tax rate, and I own 2 different small businesses that got free money from the government, and then I also own stocks and real estate, which have boomed as a result of all these policies. Now, the policies were meant to help the little guy, the guy who doesn't own stocks or real estate, or who may have lost their job. And I think looking back at it, if you just, like you brought up the labor shortage, for example, or the inflation that we do see in asset values, it's the wealthy who have benefited from these policies, and the little guy has, I think, again, they've been left behind.
Yeah, and let me just put a little marker on this, because I think it's important to say is that the money that you got was not free money. That was your money that you basically loaned the government without realizing it, and are going to be continuing to pay in terms of larger interest rates that will crowd out additional spending in years to come. And you're paying in terms of a distortion. So yes, for some of the assets, if you got in early, you saw an increase in the value of those assets. But if you didn't, and you want to purchase something, or now if you just want to go out and purchase anything, whether it be food or gas or an asset, you're paying an inflated price for that. So I think that's really important to underscore. But yes, it very much did transfer all of these benefits to the wealthiest. That if you were a saver or a retiree that was trying to earn interest on your money, so that you could even keep up with inflation, now you have to take on so much additional risk in order to even get a couple percentage points on your money. Yet these bigger companies are getting the loans from the bank at these very minimal interest rates, that they're going out and competing in the market for assets. We're seeing these big companies buy up residential housing. Now you have to compete with your house with a big firm. And so it really, for people who say, oh, we're doing this to protect, the little guy, or to keep the playing field fair, it really isn't. And, yes, you may not see a quote unquote tax increase, but, inflation is a hidden tax increase. That's, less dollars that you have as someone who's poor middle class to go out and spend on goods and services. So it's really a huge distortion. And because so many people in this country don't understand economics and finance, which I think is intentional, because these kinds of policies, we wouldn't be able to get away with them from the governing class if people really understood what they meant.
I think one of the things that struck me as the most ridiculous about the PPP was they came out with it and they said they were going to help save small businesses, and so they gave them 2.5 months of payroll to tide them over. But then they kept them shut down and didn't give them any additional funding for, what was it, 8 or 10 months, something like that. So
Yes.
So there was the whole 7 months where they were supposed to continue on, but they couldn't open their doors. And so that was kind of the, I just kept wondering, like, if it's so important, why aren't you putting your money where your mouth is? So you talked about how, all of the big companies did well during it. How can smaller companies, next time around, because let's be honest, something like this is probably going to happen again in the not too distant future. Next time around, how do small businesses come together and compete with the lobbying force like the big companies have?
Yeah, I mean, so here's the interesting thing is that, like, small business is hugely influential by numbers, but because they're independent, not from a straight up lobbying standpoint. And so it's important to be individuals, but come together as individuals, so to speak, and to stand up. In businesses, it was shocking to me that businesses for the most part, went along with this. There are some examples, and I have a few in the book, and some others that I know of that just said, no, I'm not doing this. And I have encouraged, and we're starting to see it, other small businesses to sue, because you can't do that. You can't just shut somebody down, leave their competitor down the street open, and then not compensate them for it. And the worst part about it is that, again, it's the government doesn't have any money. It's either our money that they've collected as taxes, or it's money that they've printed out of nowhere that devalues the money that we have in our pockets. So, at some point we need to push back against these violations of rights so that it just doesn't happen. I mean, we cannot endure something like this happening again. And it does take people who are independent to say, okay, if I want independence and freedom, it's not something that I can just expect. It's something that I actually have to fight for, which is frustrating and annoying when you're the ones that are being targeted, when it's hard enough to run your own business. But whether it's, these kinds of shutdowns and mandates, whether it's things like the PRO Act, or, bumps in the minimum wage, it's really important, even if it doesn't impact you specifically as a small business owner, to think about in principle, well, what if it weren't this specific thing, but it was this other thing? With the same principle, would it impact me? And I'm going to stand up for it. And I think that we need to do more of that, because the reality is that the biggest impediment for small business at this point in time is the government just putting up more and more barriers. And if they got out of the way, we would have more opportunities for small business, more wealth creation, and more economic freedom. And, that's the best outcome for everyone, because it flows through communities, it creates jobs, it creates innovations that make people's lives better. And unfortunately, they're selling a different song. Oh, no, we know better. But you have that same group that says that they know better, who thought that they could shut down a third of the economy, turn it back on like you were power cycling a modem, and that you'd just be getting, everything would be going along according to plan. And whether it's the labor shortages or the supply chain issues or transportation or inflation or any of these outcomes, either they didn't see them or they didn't care. And either way, that's problematic.
You talked a bit about inflation, about the dollar. Curious to hear your thoughts on the future of cryptocurrency. El Salvador and it looks like a few other countries are going to be following suit as far as legalizing Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as legal tender, as an actual currency to do regular transactions. What are your thoughts about all this, and how does it tie into the title of your book?
So I would say that, the reason why so many people are interested in cryptocurrency is because of this push towards decentralization. Just like small business is the decentralization of the economy, and gig work is the decentralization of the corporate job, and the podcast that you're hosting is the decentralization of the corporate press. The same thing for cryptocurrency and DeFi. They're trying to decentralize some of this bad acting and central power that's around central banking and the finance community. So I think that the reasoning behind it is smart, and I think decentralization is a good pushback. Now, in terms of crypto itself, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. There's a way to look at it as a currency, and there's a way to look at it, as sort of a hard asset. And if you are looking at a currency, something that's something monetary, usually you're looking at it as a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and or store of value. And I think that crypto, even Bitcoin, isn't really there at this point in time. When you talk about unit of exchange, everything always seems to come back to dollars. People aren't really talking about things in that particular unit. Even though we have some of these countries that have adopted it, it's still clunky in terms of a medium of exchange, and certainly not widespread use. And then in terms of store of value, although the proponents will say, oh, look at the fact that it's gone through the roof, it's a great store of value. Most people who are in finance would say that the volatility behind it does not make it a great store of value yet. Now it's young. Maybe that evens out over time, and it starts to take on some of those characteristics. But I look at it more as a potential alternative asset class, something like the way people look at, a commodity like gold, like art, like wine. And I think, like anything else, we say it has value because of a social contract. We've all agreed that something has value. So is it possible that cryptocurrency becomes that long-term social contract? And there are these markets for, whether it's the NFT piece of it, or if it's Bitcoin, or some things that haven't even been invented. I think it's absolutely a possibility, but I think it's just too early to tell. So I tend to approach it as any sort of alternative investment, and something that's highly speculative. And if you want to include it in your portfolio, just like you would, a startup or, anything else, I think it makes sense to consider it potentially depending on your own situation as an alternative asset. But I certainly wouldn't be putting my entire portfolio into it. And then, in terms of that pushback, again, you've got the stock market, you've got a government collecting taxes that, by the way, has military attached to it, that all wants to be in control of the money supply. So the likelihood that they are going to make it really difficult for this to take hold while they're trying to get their own digital currency out, I think that creates an additional stumbling block, but doesn't, again, necessarily take it completely out of the running.
I want to hear some of your advice and predictions on what we can expect, not just for the next 2 years or the next 4 years, but let's say over the next 10 years. Is the government going to continue to overreach? Are we going to see massive tax increases across the board? Is inflation here to stay? And then as far as your advice goes, people who do have money sitting around in their 401ks or in their bank accounts, where should that money be? Should it be in stocks, real estate, cryptocurrency, gold? Tell us more.
Sure. So again, this is all not financial advice, as my cover my behind disclaimer. And also, if I had a perfect crystal ball on this, I'd be sitting on my mega yacht in the Mediterranean and not having this discussion with you guys. So this is all just educated guesswork.
Sure.
Certainly, from the trajectory that we're on, we are, at least in the United States, on a trajectory, to look like best case scenario, more like the UK or France, worst case scenario like Venezuela. But there is that push to really become a socialist type of nation, or hybrid socialist, hybrid central planning type of nation. And in many respects, we're already there in terms of the amount of money that the government spends, the number of laws that we have, the purview of where the government is reaching into. We're not nearly as free as we thought. And even, over the last 18 months, the stomping on property rights and individual rights has really moved us in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, I just see so much of a trend and not enough people pushing back, because there are so many things to push back on, and not really understanding the economic implications, that I am very concerned that some of these things are going to get put in place that become very difficult to undo. And, it's unfortunate. It just means that we'll have more people on the government dole and fewer people with opportunities to innovate, and fewer innovations that make life better, but not necessarily getting all of the way there. But I hope I'm wrong. And that's why, part of the reason why I'm out there spreading the word, and there are a lot of other people out there spreading the word to push back. So none of it is a foregone conclusion. It all depends on how people react to these things, and if they're willing to stand up and push back. But that's certainly the trajectory that we're on today. In terms of places to look at for future value, I do think that inflation is not transitory. There may be parts of it that is considered transitory, but things like, we've got almost 11 million jobs, or maybe it's a little more at this point, that are unfilled in this country. So, I think that the potential for wage inflation and it's going to take the supply chain a long time to sort itself out, at least for the next few years, are going to increase. So, hard assets are usually a good shelter, in a place that a lot of people will consider putting money as a hedge against inflation. I think if you're
and a hard asset would be something like gold,
or a house,
even real estate.
Real estate, exactly.
Land.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that if you're a long-term investor, like it's hard to play the cycles, and you have to be looking kind of out in the future. And I think that that's sort of the best way to kind of look at things. And if you think about like the renaissance that we've had and the incredible growth in technology over the last 20 years, with the web and all of these cloud companies and whatnot, I think that given demographics, not just here in the US, but worldwide, and even just something like the pandemic that we've been through, I think that healthcare is a likely place that's going to have that kind of a renaissance over the next, the next 20 years. So I would be looking at, different companies that have different innovations or different services, within the healthcare sector that might benefit from kind of being the next wave. So I think just as an investment thesis, that's something that I'm particularly interested in. And over long periods of time, it's just, I think it makes sense to have a diversified portfolio. Even the best professional investors have a hard time beating what happens on average in markets. So have diversification in terms of your assets. Talk to a financial advisor or use a robo-advisor kind of based on your age and your risk tolerance and whatnot to kind of figure out what that right scenario is for you. And then to the extent that you do some research or you come across a thesis where you're like, I feel really solid about this and I want to take more risk on this thing. I think that there are times when that makes sense as well. But there really has to be a good thesis. If you're doing it, kind of casually, it's pretty hard to beat, whatever happens on average over long periods of time. But the most important thing is to consistently invest and stand up and call your representative and tell them to rein in the Fed and tell them to stop printing money.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the points there. But one last topic I want to talk about, which you have touched on in the media, is I guess the best way to call it would be the promotion of racism across every part of life. And American Express recently told its employees that not only did they have a history of racism, but that capitalism, our system of working and earning money, is racist. And I'm just trying to understand what they meant by that. As a person of color, I've actually found I said earlier, I own real estate, I own stocks, I own two businesses, and capitalism has been anti-racist for me. In fact, we hire people from even outside the United States. The somewhat free market allows us to hire freelancers and independent contractors from all over the world, people who are very talented and who are of different races. So I was just a little confused with what American Express, a really successful global corporation, what they meant by this.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to make sense out of gibberish and insanity. And unfortunately, a lot of these companies are being, sort of ensconced by this wokeness, and they feel like, oh, if we don't take this on, we're going to be seen as bad people or something. And again, I think there's also a fundamental misunderstanding of capitalism, which is just, freedom and choice and transparency with the guardrails of property rights. The reality is we have the data sets, at scale over time throughout history. There is nothing that has lifted more people out of poverty, regardless of their color, race, creed, background, than capitalism. And having any form of central planning, and I try not to get caught up in socialism versus communism versus democratic socialism versus whatever, because then you kind of get away from the point being a handful of people making decisions using force, control, coercion, and usually opacity. None of that has created wealth for anybody, particularly people of color in a marginalized arena, because the government doesn't create wealth unless you happen to be in the club. if you are in the government, or a lobbyist, or a union, head of a union or a special interest group, or a head of a big business or something, then yes, then the government creates wealth for you, but not on a widespread basis. There's nobody on the government dole that has become wealthy because the government has done that. They've only just created barriers. So I think that you would actually find the opposite, that the more the government gets out of the way and removes the barriers, which is moves towards capitalism, the more opportunities that people of all races and creeds have to participate in wealth creation. And that's really what we should be focused on. And unfortunately, so many people have co-opted the messaging. But you're starting to see people is getting to that tipping point where people are starting to go, yeah, I kind of seen what's happened over the last 18 months, or, Nicki Minaj, right? Like they tried to silence her. The media tried to silence her and make her out to be a bad person. And she pushed back and said, yeah, I'm not going to be okay with this. I think there are enough people who are kind of seeing this overstepping of rights and starting to question things. So hopefully we can continue to spread the messaging and have the abundance mentality, and keep that ladder down and help more people climb up it and take advantage of capitalism in ways that benefit people and allow them to participate in that economic freedom, instead of warping the message in a way that ends up only hurting the people that they purport to be helping.
Well, you use a term that I think is the key, and that is mentality. if you have the mentality of constantly being a victim because of your own shortcomings, and I'll give an example, then you're going to just go around saying America's racist, capitalism is racist. And now we're seeing movements saying English grammar is racist, math is racist. It's deeply rooted in white supremacy, even though Asians are supreme in math according to SAT scores. And I just noticed that a lot of these people going around spewing this Marxist ideology, they just weren't very good at whatever it is that they hate, whether it's making money or holding a job or math or English grammar. They just weren't very good at it. They didn't succeed at it. And so they found their friends who are in the same boat and want to bring down everybody else who did succeed at it. And initially I thought this only had to do with money, but now we're seeing it trickle down, like I said, to kindergarten curriculums. I mean, it's trickling down to math, to accounting, to the ABCs. And that's, I think, somewhat scary on the one hand. But on the other hand, if you're a parent and Adam homeschools his kids, and even if you don't homeschool your kids, as a parent, this is where you have to step up to the plate and share your values and not just depend on the media or a public school system.
Amen to that. And I would say, take a look at the people who are the leaders of all of these different, initiatives that are dividing people by race and creed, or who are anti-capitalist or whatnot. The amount of money that these people have made.
They're doing great.
I mean, they're doing phenomenally well. I mean, we could go through between the heads of Black Lives Matter, between some of these people who are
Bernie Sanders,
CRT. There's this kid who is like one of the big Twitch streamers who just bought like a $3 million house. They're all using capitalism to promote anti-capitalism and getting wealthy.
Well, they're good. They're good marketers. I actually respect that. They're good marketers, and they're legally conning their base. So I respect that. I just, the followers, I just feel, look, you gotta think for yourselves. You can't just watch some guy on Twitch and live your life according to this random person.
Well, or just ask the questions and just say, well, I don't understand if it's that bad. Like, how are you doing this? Like it does, just be a little bit more curious and ask more questions. And listen, as I said, like our academic system, particularly in economics, is poor. But the resources are out there now in terms of the internet to educate yourself, and I hope that more people will continue to do that and continue to spread the principles. Because when you're young, you're not supposed to know all of these things, but as you get older, you need to start asking more questions and be curious and not take everything at face value. And any study of history will give you the answer. And if you have to say, oh, real this has never been tried before, then you also probably believe in unicorns. And I don't mean the Silicon Valley types.
Yeah. And I should also say, when I was growing up, it was, and I use this term here in the interview, it was people of color. Now it's BIPOC, 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 which is Black and Indigenous people of color. So actually, somebody told me recently, they said, you're not a person of color, you're not a minority, even though my race is less than 1% of the U.S. population. We're not considered minorities because our median income level is number one in the United States. So
it just goes to show, right? Is whether you're Indian or Asian or like myself, I'm Jewish. Dave Chappelle, my favorite comic, always said, you ever try to play who's the more oppressed game with the Jewish people? That's a really hard game to win, So like if you want to go through the whole, rigmarole of that, there are many of us that are in communities that have, been marginalized or that are smaller minorities. And when they start saying, well, you don't count because XYZ, like, that they're just making stuff up. And so it's just important for us to continue to push that out. And I also just think, just in terms of individualism, again, I'm Jewish. I wear my Jewish star very proudly, but at the same time, like, I'm not responsible for everything that every other Jewish person does, nor is everyone else responsible for what I do. We're all individuals in this country, and at the end of the day, the individual is the smallest minority, and it's why the Constitution was set up to protect the rights of the individual, and it's something that more people need to talk about.
Yeah, and as far as your being Jewish goes, my being Indian American, I think these are case studies that people need to, and the media needs to publicize more. Of course, they're not going to, but people need to do their own research. And I grew up around so many Jewish people. The schools I went to, college, do business with, and have continued to do business with a lot of Jewish people. And then, of course, being Indian, I'm sure your parents, maybe your grandparents, when they came here, they didn't just come here with nothing. I mean, they came here most likely to save their lives, because wherever
Correct.
they were before, forget about money. It was, are we even going to be alive tomorrow? and the whole victim mentality, because we don't do it either. But now I'm seeing these newer generations, like Gen Z is so different from Gen Y, which I'm part of Gen Y. I'm a millennial. And then whatever generation is going to be after Gen Z is going to be even more different than that. And these new generations are coming up, and they just have no idea who their grandparents were, what they had to go through. They weren't going out. They didn't immigrate here to go out and burn down buildings and loot and steal and march and protest. I mean, they came here, they put their heads down, they worked hard, they earned a living, they provided for their families, they raised good children. These values are getting lost.
I mean, amen to that. And, just in terms of, the Jewish people, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that a third of the entire Jewish population was exterminated within the last 100 years. I mean, that's how recent it was, and how big of an attack it was. And again, that, when the people, and my fellow relatives and people that I know escaped from that, it was, okay, I'm going to not be a victim, and I'm going to go, and instead of channeling that into a bad place, I'm going to use that as motivation to create a better life. And we're going to focus on family, and we're going to focus on education. We're going to focus on lifting people up. And that's where the success has come from. And like you said, you see it in the Indian community, you see it in the Asian community. And, I think it's just an important thing to go back to, what are those principles, and not make it so much about, oh, it's this color or this gender or this whatever. It goes back to principles. And unfortunately, principles are one of the things that have been eroded in this country, and I think would be very helpful, as a way to kind of get things back on track.
Yeah, well, we're relatively new here in the United States compared to the Jewish population, but I think my prediction is it's a matter of time until the anti-Hindu sentiment starts hitting, because the anti-Semitism I've seen just over the last 1 to 2 years, it's just astounding to me, and it's like, what the heck happened? Like, what happened in a matter of 20 years? Like, did people not know what happened during the Holocaust? Do people not understand what's going on? Like, why, what the Jews had to go through, and now all of a sudden, the media has portrayed Jews as the bad people. Just like, what's going on? And people believe it. They eat it up, and they march, and they rally, and they do all these things because of some event that happened, one small little event that happened in Palestine or in Israel, and boom, that affects everybody here. And that's okay. That's okay according to the media or to some segments of the population, but it's not okay to even mention a certain word. You know, we got to cancel certain words. It's not okay to mention certain words or certain ethnicities.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we are in a situation where dividing us makes us weaker, and it makes the big entities more powerful. So, the
more profitable.
The number one thing we can do after the principles is to come together and reject that and just say, you know what, we're not falling for that. We're individuals, and we're going to treat people as such. So it's an important lesson. I'm glad that you brought it up.
Well, the takeaway here is, once again, to all our listeners who are working from home, you can't get caught up in this nonsense and lose sight of what's most important. You can't lose sight of values and of, like I said earlier, raising good children, working hard, putting your head down, starting a business, working your job, earning money. That's what you should be. And I don't like telling people what to do, but if the goal here is to succeed in life, you're going to be much more, you're going to have a better chance of succeeding doing that than going on Twitter and blasting Nicki Minaj or your cousin who voted for somebody different than you did. So I think that's the biggest takeaway here when it comes to understanding, I think, what are weapons of mass distraction when AMEX tells its employees that they're a racist company and they're apologizing and that capitalism is racist. And then people running with it and then trying to change the laws and change the rules because AMEX made this statement. I think that's just a waste of time and something that I actually not just frown upon, but look down upon. I just don't have time for that. I do enjoy reading about stuff like this because it's amusing to me. But hey, work hard and keep listening to our show. Listen to Carol and read her stuff at carolroth.com, carolroth.com, Carol, Roth.com. And Carol, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners or anything else you'd like to promote?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to thank both of you guys for having me. Appreciate the platform. From the War on Small Business, if you want to pick it up, I encourage you to do it through a local bookstore or through bookshop.org, which will fulfill it through a local bookstore. I think that not enough of us support small businesses, even though we are small businesses. Gets easy to get caught up in going with the big guys. So, consider that in terms of your spending. And just building on your last point there, stay focused and have that abundance mindset and stay focused on your goals, because you're right. I love that weapons of mass distraction. There are so many things that can just take you completely out of the game. And at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to control most of that anyway. So yes, stand up and take a stand, from time to time and call your representatives and whatnot. But also, the best way to be successful is to focus on your success. And I think that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah, and that's why I have a rule. And that rule is I only spend time on things that provide value, direct value to me. So it's not just money, hey, I'm going to read this thing because it's going to make me more money. It's also, okay, I'm going to go play tennis because that's going to help my health. It's going to improve my health. I'm going to go run around the block because that's going to improve my health, and I'm going to live longer. And in turn, that's going to make me a better husband and a better father. And someday I'll be alive to see grandchildren. And when it comes to weapons of mass distraction, most of them, they don't do anything to help you or improve your situation. Even me, when it comes to, we don't talk much politics on this show, but I've been doing some political commentating, been invited to speak for different groups, webinars, done some media hits, and also released some content for sale. So I have a direct involvement. It directly affects what I'm trying to accomplish here. But I think for a lot of people, they're focusing on things, if you're a 30-year-old single man and you're going out marching, trying to change the public school curriculum and get rid of honors math classes, I'm not really sure who you're helping out there outside of maybe hurting your nephew or your niece, hurting their futures. but that's probably not why they're doing it in the first place. So
Yeah.
I think people just need to think through these things and focus on what's most important to them. Just like your parents and grandparents, just like my parents when they came here, those values have gotten lost. But that's, I think, talking about the Federal Reserve and the government spending and all, we wouldn't need to have as much of this if people took personal responsibility.
Very, very well said. And as I have a quick way to boil it down, ask yourself, are you chasing ROE, return on ego, or ROI, return on investment? Spend more time chasing return on investment, even if it's an investment, like you said, in your health, than trying to get a return on your ego.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Carol Roth, thanks once again for joining us on the Work From Home Show. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list. Email us hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Follow us on social media. Leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you use to listen to us. And until next week, keep on working from home.